All right, good afternoon. My name is Yana Krupnikov. I'm an assistant professor at Stony Brook, and I'm going to introduce Robert Huckfeldt. Robert Huckfeldt is a distinguished professor of political science at the University of California at Davis. He is the past president of MPSA, past chair of the Elections, Public Opinion, and Voting Behavior and Political Network sections of APSA. He has served in a number of administrative roles, including political science department chair at Indiana. And actually, I was in Indiana as well. Although I was there a number of years after him, my mailbox said Robert Huckfeldt. So everyone just knew that my mail went to Robert Huckfeldt. And he's the chair at UC Davis and the director of the UC Center Sacramento and the UC Davis Institute for Governmental Affairs. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So his topic today is disproportional influence, movers and shakers among the rank and file. He says politics occurs in the corridors of power, but also in the corridors of daily life. Some citizens are thus more influential in the collective process producing political outcomes. Several issues arise. Who matters, why, and with what consequence? So I'm going to let him speak, and then we'll have time for questions.
Thank you, Yana. So, one person, one vote, really? Most of us know that politics is a little more complicated than that, and that even though we live in a democratic society and have a democratic political system, some people matter more than others. But usually when we talk about disproportional influence, we talk about movers and shakers who occupy the corridors of power. And we talk about differentials in influence between those people who are insiders and those people who are outsiders. And when we think about the outsiders, that is, the people that occupy the corridors of everyday life, we sort of treat them as an undifferentiated mass. Now, I think viewing voters that way and viewing citizens that way sort of radically underestimates the variations in influence and marginality among those who do populate the corridors of everyday life. Some citizens are indeed more equal than others. Some citizens matter more. Some citizens' opinions have a bigger effect. Some citizens get involved in ways that magnify their own influence and the consequence of their own preferences. These individuals that Lazarsfeld, called opinion leaders, constitute the experts and activists in everyday life. And they, in turn, play a crucial role in democratic politics that we frequently ignore, both as analysts of politics, political scientists, but also among the people that do the campaigns and run the elections, the practitioners, if you will. Why is that? It's unusual that that's the case because, most of us might have a sense that you'd have different expectations. Well, part of the reason is because we have a standard model of public opinion that's really based on individual independence, and we think about public opinion in terms of individuals. The enduring dominance of the individualistic model really has gone forward both in theory and practice. In practice, we take people, we rip them out of their context, we treat them as though they're isolated individuals who are indeed independent of their context. We interview them, we aggregate all these interviews, and then we talk about public opinion in the mass, when in fact the individual opinions that people hold are in fact not only products of what's between their own ears, but all the stimuli that's coming at them and how they process that information. So we're really abstracting citizens in time and space, quite apart from any spatial or temporal context they're located within. But the reality is, the social and political reality is that these are individually interdependent citizens, not independent. And so electorates are not simple summations of independent individuals. Rather, they are complex products of interacting, intersecting, communicating actors who come together and reach decisions. Now, most of us, economists, political scientists, certainly psychologists and certainly sociologists, don't really believe this model. Most of us accept the fact that people act strategically, that they interact with each other, that their behavior is interdependent, that they formulate their own opinions and their own behavior based on the opinions and behavior of others. So where does it come from? Well, part of it's due to an individualistic revolution that we really experienced in public opinion research. Back in the day, in the early days of empirical research, Actually, in the early days of statistics in general, when people first started, inventing statistics in the late 19th century, there was a rise of empirical analysis of people, okay, of social life, based on aggregate observation. Durkheim's Suicide, Tingston's sort of wonderful book on Stockholm precincts, based on aggregate behavior at the precinct level. Aberle's book on, after he emigrated from Nazi Germany and came to LSU, he wrote a book on Nazi voting in Schleswig-Holstein and what the causes and consequences were. And ultimately, V.O. Key, our own V.O. Key, in 1949 in One-Party Politics. Now, all of these were really at the aggregate level of observation, and I sort of point them out in part because, particularly in the case of Tingston and Aberle and Key, they made inferences about individuals. They took individuals into account. But ultimately, they sort of located people in socio-political, geographical settings that they used to explain the behavior and the outcomes. Now, not long after this, we experienced, or during the period, overlapping with this period actually, we had the advent of modern polling and the advent of modern election studies. So about this time, George Gallup started interviewing people. Really, the first serious George Gallup poll was in 1936. The Columbia studies in 1940 and 1948 studied individuals, albeit individuals located in particular settings. The ongoing National Election Studies series started at that point, and interestingly, and maybe coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, W.S. Robinson wrote his book on the ecological fallacy, okay? Now, the ecological fallacy basically, in a nutshell, said, be really careful when you correlate group behavior with group characteristics. In other words, the proportion of a precinct that has a social characteristic with the proportion of a precinct that votes a particular way, because you can really produce misleading results, and that's the truth. The lesson that most of us took away from the piece, from his work, was, boy, don't do aggregate data analysis anymore. Instead, do individual level analyses, and that way you're not going to get yourself in trouble. You don't have to worry about these ecological fallacies. You're home free. Well, not long after, Leo Goodman, who was an incredible contributor to this literature, we're still basing a lot of work on Leo Goodman, had this wonderful insight about the ecological fallacy, and I sort of have it there in short terms. He said that ecological fallacy arises when group behavior is not constant across context. Okay, when group behavior, the behavior of individuals classified according to the group they belong to, when that changes across context, if you try to correlate contextual properties and make inferences about individual behavior, you're going to be in trouble. Friedman calls this the constancy assumption. Okay, if you can't make the constancy assumption, you've got a problem. Now, Goodman lays this out in the equation I have there, which is behavior, the proportion of the people that engage in a behavior is equal to the rate of that behavior, P1, multiplied times the group that behaves at P1, plus the group of the other group, 1 minus S, times the rate at which they engage in the behavior. Now, Goodman's point is, if P1 and P2 are constant, you've got it nailed. Okay, you don't have to worry about an ecological fallacy. And what you end up with then is P2 plus P1 minus P2 times S. In other words, you can do the simple regression, and you'll be okay. The problem is, who knows if P1 and P2 are constant across groups, across settings? It's really tough to know that. But the thing we missed out on is there's still a lingering problem here. So the problem is, if P1 and P2 are not constant, you may very well end up with an aggregate fallacy if you do an aggregate level analysis. But here's the rub. If P1 and P2 are constant, an individualistic analysis is not going to nail it either, right? Because you're going to have varying P1 and P2 across contexts, which means in turn that you're just replacing an ecological fallacy with an individual level fallacy. We can't assume, just because we have individual level data, that in fact we have constant behavior within a social category across time and space, is the problem. Hence the lingering problems. Ecological fallacies are the flip side of individualistic fallacies and vice versa. And the question becomes, how should we think about contextual contingencies operating on political behavior? This is a reconstruction of an argument James Coleman made in 1964 in Introduction to mathematical sociology. And to just sketch it out for you briefly, you know, you walk out the door in the morning, take a walk in your neighborhood, and that creates opportunity 1, O sub 1, for an interaction. And assuming that you sort of randomly walk out into your neighborhood, your odds of running into, let's say, a Democrat or a Republican are proportional to the incidence of those people in the neighborhood, okay? Let's imagine that you're a Democrat and you want to hang out with other Democrats. Well, the odds are, and if S sub J is the proportion of Democrats, the odds that you'll run into a Democrat are S sub J, and if you want to interact with a Democrat, your search is done and you've got a Democrat to interact with, okay? On the other hand, if you walk out your front door and you run into a 1 minus S sub J, a non-Democrat, then you have a decision to make, okay? Because you've got this Democrat or this non-Democrat, and you've got to decide whether or not you're going to interact with this person. You can, in fact, say, yeah, the heck with it, I'm just going to interact with this person and stop the search, or you can go back, right, and try again. Now, at each contingency along the way, there's some probability that you'll say, hey, I'm going to reject this person, I'm going to keep looking, okay, and that's R. Now, the interesting rub about this is that we really should think about both of those things as stochastic processes. Now, I have, where I work, a lot of the people are of a particular party, okay, probably like where you work too. But when I walk down my hallway, I end up talking to some people, there are people down my hallway that don't have the same political preferences I have. One of them in particular is a lot of fun, okay? So depending on the day and what's in the news, I may end up talking with the guy that doesn't share my preferences, and it's kind of a random shot whether we end up talking about politics and whether we interact and the rest. The point is, choice is not determinate and neither is the environment. And so you have this intersection of these two processes going on at the same time. And the intersection of those two stochastic processes is where social interaction kind of gets defined and structured. Now, it turns out that if I know the proportion of the social group in a context, and I know the rate at which an individual is in fact incorporating people from that social group in that person's environment, I can in fact arrive at an estimate for R, okay? The probability that they would reject association and companionship with someone outside their social group. Everybody with me on this? Okay. Now, we estimated a long time ago, first time we did this, we estimated those probabilities, and it turns out what I'm going to show you on the left-hand side, these are data from the Lauman's Detroit area study that had social network data, and over on the right-hand, or on the left-hand axis, we've got the, on the left side, we have the estimated probability that a local friend will be working class as a function of whether or not the person who's choosing the friend, the respondent, is in fact middle class or working class. And what you see there is an intercept shift, right? So as the working class along the x-axis gets higher, both groups, working class and middle class, are more likely to interact with working class people. All right. So in short, they're responding to the environment. They, you know, and when the environment gets more working class, they're more likely to have working class friends. The flip of this is, though, that we can also estimate for each of those lines, we can also estimate the rejection parameters that we end up with. And the rejection parameters are on the right-hand side. Now, focus your attention for a second on the working class respondents, so the top line on the left-hand side, and then look over on the right-hand side, and you'll see this corresponding map of the rejection parameter. And what you see is that the rejection parameter gets increasingly small as the working class population gets increasingly large. So the indication here is that minorities, people who are in minority circumstances, a working class individual in a middle class context and vice versa, will get more selective and work harder at trying to, you know, at trying to keep homogeneity within their group. But look back on the left-hand side, and you'll see they usually lose out on this. Albeit the fact that they get more selective as they become a minority, they end up with, they still end up with a network, a social network that in fact reflects the underlying structure of the pool of people which they're drawing from. Okay, this is different data, but and I'm not going to show you the rejection parameters, but remember we can think about this in terms of rejection parameters. And by the way, we replicated the results in the past slide with South Bend data from 1984, and same basic pattern when you look at Reagan voters and Mondale voters and neighborhood death studies. This is networks of, the problem with those data is people look at it and understandably say, yeah, but those are you know, we're talking about small groups. We're talking about neighborhoods. I mean, people locate themselves in neighborhoods in order to be around people like themselves, maybe. Okay, that's the big sort of idea. Maybe not very many people locate themselves in nation states to have co-partisans that are nearby. Okay, so let's do this at the nation state level. All right, so these were a series of cross-national election studies that I participated in the early 1990s. In Japan, 1993, the United States, 1992, and the first pan-German election in 1990. And what you see there is each of those symbols is each of those plotting symbols is in fact it represents a party's coalition. So down there in the lower left-hand corner, the W that has an FDP pointing toward it, that's the FDP in West Germany, because we're treating West Germany and East Germany separately in this election. And what you see is that, well, gee, about 17.5% maybe of the East German electorate, in fact, voted for the FDP in that election. They're not doing so well now. But when you look over on the left-hand side, the agreement level within those voters' networks is just, you know, a little, you know, not quite 20%. It's a little bit higher, but not much higher. Okay, so in other words, the left axis is the agreement level within the supporters' networks, and the horizontal axis is the supporters of the party in the election in the country they're in. So if you look way up on the higher, well, first of all, that straight line there, the solid line, that's the 45-degree angle line. That's where everybody would be if interaction was completely random. Okay, if we just randomly went out and select, you know, just sort of willy-nilly, we all ended up with people we talked politics with in our social networks, that's where we would all lie. But everybody's above that line. So certainly there's some people expressing preferences or, you know, somehow getting themselves in networks that in fact are higher, have a higher level of co-travelers or co-partisans than you would expect due to chance alone. But the important thing is none of it's up at the 100% level, right? I mean, we stopped counting at 70%. And the only parties that are up close to 70% are, in fact, all the major parties and Komito, which is a Japanese party. I'll come back to Komito. But all those parties up in the upper right-hand corner, that's the West German Christian Democrats, the East German Christian Democrats, the U.S. Democrats, the U.S. Republicans, and the LDP in Japan, okay? All those parties end up with about, you know, somewhere between, you know, around 50, a little bit less than 50% to a little over 50% of the vote. And they all have about the same level of heterogeneity within the networks of their supporters. Okay, as you move back, you sort of, that dotted line is in fact the simpler regression line you would fit. And so what you see is that the group, as the electorate, as the proportion of the electorate gets larger, the level of homogeneity within the supporters' networks gets larger as well. But in fact, heterogeneity is, at least to me, the level of heterogeneity is more impressive than the level of homogeneity. It certainly is not the case that people are clustering with people that are just like themselves within these networks. So what are the consequences? What are the implications? Well, these are data from the American National Election Study in 2000, which had a network name generator that basically asked people, give us the names of the 3 people you're most likely to have talked about politics with in the past election. And based on that, asked them, you know, who they supported, or who each of these individuals supported. Well, what you find out is a third of the Bush voters have Gore discussants, a third of the Gore voters have Bush discussants, and less than half of each have homogeneous networks composed of people who share their preferences. Yeah, there's some sorting going on, and yeah, people are exercising selection, but in fact, there's a fair amount of heterogeneity, and if we don't sort of take account of the heterogeneity, we're missing something in the analysis. Well, okay, so these are networks, but how do they compare to sort of everyday networks? I mean, we haven't sort of addressed the problem of, well, maybe people have customized networks they talk about politics with. Maybe when I walk down I don't, but you could argue that maybe when I walk down the hallway at my place of work, if I'm going to talk about politics, I'm very careful only to go into people's offices that I agree with, okay? So let's take a look and see if we can get a little bit of handle on that. In 1996, we did a study in Indianapolis and St. Louis, and we asked everybody this name generator. and asked them to give us the names of actually, we did more people, but we did a number of people. And we harvested a number of names from each of the respondents. But we used two different name generators. One name generator we used to ask people this question was a name generator that just simply said, can you tell me the names of the people with whom you're most likely to discuss, quote, important matters, end of quote. That's a famous name generator that the General Social Survey's been using since the late 1980s. So we used that, we flipped a coin, basically, figuratively. And if it came up heads, we asked that question. If it came up tails, we asked a different question. And instead of important matters, we said, who are the names of the people, or who are the people with whom you discussed the events of the past election campaign? Now, the question is, are they different? Okay, do people have customized networks? So they're very careful to make sure, okay, that they end up with people who are like them, and thereby eliminating the heterogeneity in their normal networks to have homogeneity in their political networks. Well, the way to what you see below are a set of dummy variable regressions, and the only thing you really have to focus on is the constant, which is the mean for the people who, the mean on each of these four variables, who gave us important matters discussants, and then add to that the politics name generator coefficient, which in the first column is 0.02, to see the difference in the mean between the important matters and the politics name generator. So in the first column, the percent for the same presidential vote is 0.63. That's for one person, okay, just one of the discussants. Remember, you have to multiply these together if you have like 4 discussants in terms of your odds. But 0.63 if it's an important matters discussant, 0.65 if it's a politics discussant, and needless to say, it's not statistically discernible effect, and anyway, it's so substantively small we probably don't care about it. The next one is mean political discussion frequency on a scale from 1 to 4, and there you see that we've got a big fat t-value, okay, the 660, and the coefficient, is not huge, but you do get a bump, okay? It goes from 2.7 to basically 2.9. All right, so yeah, they talk with their political discussants more, but they don't necessarily agree with them more. The third column is mean political disagreement in sort of frequency in general, okay? And there again, it's surprising, right? Because in fact, they disagree more with the people they talk about politics with. My argument to you would be that how can you talk about politics without disagreeing? Okay, that it's part of the game maybe. And finally, mean political knowledge, well, there's some indication that these discussants, the political discussants, in fact, know more. So we asked the discussant, or the main respondents, how much do you think Joe knows about politics? And they tell us. So taken as a whole, there's not a lot of evidence here that, your normal everyday friendship is a whole lot different from your everyday political discussion partner in terms of producing, in particular, producing homogeneity. Now, if the big sort, that is our effort to surround ourselves with people that are similar to ourselves, if the big sort and social influence, which I'm sort of trying to argue with you is maybe something we should pay attention to, are so important, how does heterogeneity survive within these networks? On the other hand, see, I've got an obligation, right? I'm telling you they matter, and I'm showing you that there's all this heterogeneity. What's up? Well, part of it is because we have to think about this not in terms of dyads entirely, but we have to think of it in terms of networks. And if you look at the first one, these are sort of hypothetical networks, but in fact, what I'm telling you is sustained in the analysis of the Indianapolis-St. Louis study, that if we have a network of 4 people, and one of them is, let's say the person in white there is as a Republican, and the 3 people in dark are the person in white is a Republican, and the other 3 are Democrats. That's a really highly unlikely situation. We very seldom find an individual in these studies who holds a preference for a particular party and receives absolutely no support for that in their surrounding discussion network. You just don't find it. What you do find is what is in the second part down here. You find 2 individuals who disagree, the left-hand side, or the left-hand side of the right network and the right-hand side of the left network, who has someone with whom they disagree. But then when you go out and look at the discussants, their other discussants, you find out that that point of disagreement is in fact a minority condition within their larger network. Now, I always tell people this is kind of like when I go to work and my colleagues tell me a bunch of stuff about politics, and I come home and I sit down at the dinner table with my wife, and I try one of these ideas out on her, and she says, "You've got to be kidding me." Okay? The point is, there are people with whom we interact a lot that make up our network, and when we get a new opinion that's sort of outside the realm and we bring that back into the network, it's got to survive. And oftentimes it doesn't. And so it's not the case that all disagreement leads to changed opinions. In fact, a lot of disagreement doesn't lead to changed opinions because we have other sources of support for those opinions that we don't override. Now, I've sort of made the case so far that we should take heterogeneity seriously, and there are reasons to expect that, in fact, at an equilibrium condition, we ought to expect heterogeneity to be maintained. But now, let's turn the attention a little bit and ask a different question. And the different question is, does this interdependence create a whole, that is an electorate, that's more than the sum of its parts? Do we end up with an electorate as a whole that acts more responsibly, more knowledgeably, and more effectively, okay, than the individual voters do? Is there somehow that we're better together than we are separately? Now, I would like to tell you absolutely, but I can't really say that, all right? And we'll come back to this. But it's an important question, and you know, political scientists know this is an important question because we're always looking for the holy grail that helps explain those terrible responses we get to survey questions. You know, whenever you go do a telephone survey, the last thing you do before you go in the field is you put a set of headphones on and they go do some field tests on it. And the first time I did this, it was a terrible experience. You know, we'd put all this work into these questionnaires, and then I heard people stumbling through these answers, and you know, Philip Converse's 1964 piece came through in spades for me. You know, it made a lot of sense in that context. People bumble around. They're sort of clueless about a lot of the questions. One response is, well, maybe maybe they talk to people that know better than they do, and they get better because of that. All right, well, let's take a look at the problem. This is the estimated probability that the respondent believes that his or her discussant knows a great deal about politics. So we ask each of the main respondents for each of the discussants they name. We say, well, you know, how much do you think Joe knows about politics? And this is the probability for each of those discussants that they think the discussant knows a great deal. Now the question is, are they even capable of making that judgment? I gave a talk one time before I sort of had done the analysis I should have done, and a friend of mine, a well-esteemed political scientist, got all over my case. He said, Bob, you just cannot take that data seriously. I mean, why do we care what somebody thinks about somebody else? Because you know that there's going to be a bias in their response, and they're going to, if they agree with the person, they're going to think the person's smart, and if they don't agree, they're going to think the person's not smart, okay? Well, I had the data to do this, so I went home and I did it, and here are the results. So the first one is actual discussant expertise. We give in this particular study, Indianapolis, St. Louis, we gave the person, all the people that were part of it, we gave them a knowledge battery at the end of the survey, including we snowballed and interviewed discussants as well as main respondents, okay? So when we went out and interviewed the discussants that we had the report on from the main respondent, we asked them a series of knowledge questions. And what you see there is that actual discussant expertise is along the x-axis, and as the discussant becomes more expert, as they do better on the knowledge battery, it's reflected in the response of the main respondent. The main respondents get it. They know that they can tell us who's likely to do better on the knowledge battery. On part B, we ask the discussant, we say, well, so are you interested, we ask the standard political interest question, their own engagement in politics, if you will. And there again, it predicts the extent to which the main respondent thinks the discussant knows a great deal, even better than the knowledge does, okay? So if you're interested in politics, that fact shows through in our relationship, and I'm more likely to think you know a lot more. And then finally, part C is agreement regarding the presidential vote, and the delta is only 0.09, right? There's very little difference between, if I say I don't agree with Joe, or if I say I do agree with Joe, there's not a huge amount of difference between the rating I get, or how expert they actually are on the knowledge battery, okay? So this doesn't appear to be that people are very carefully selecting and making judgments. First of all, they're not selecting on the basis of shared opinions. They're also not making judgments about expertise solely on the basis of agreement as well. I mean, it's not just a story about do you agree or you don't agree. interest, knowledge, and engagement shows through in those relationships, and people get it. Okay, the target gets it. All right, in this context, how does opinion leadership work then? Numerous efforts show that agreement between individuals is not contingent on actual or imputed expertise. And you can show that over and over again. So if it was a simple story about expertise mattering and raising, expertise on the part of discussants raises the ship, makes everybody more knowledgeable and produces a more knowledgeable aggregate electorate, then we ought to expect that individuals who talk with experts would in fact, be more expert. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way. We don't get it, okay, never. And we've done this on a number of occasions and didn't get anything. However, we've seen that individuals do recognize political expertise, among others, and they also report higher frequencies of political discussion with experts. Okay, so there's more discussion going on with experts. And there are two possible mechanisms that might be responsible. Individuals may seek out experts. They may say, hey, I want to talk with people. I'm not going to talk with Joe. I mean, it's just so boring. He doesn't know squat about politics, and why would I talk to Joe? That's one explanation. The other explanation is, when we ask the person, how often do you talk to Joe about politics? His response really isn't, oh, quite a bit. It's actually all the time. I can't make him shut up. He's just always talking about politics. Because who are we saying are the people that are most likely to be judged expert? They're the people who talk the most, who are most interested, who know what's going on. It's those folks. It's the activists, all right? So now we're building a case for a group of discussants who matter more if, one, they're expert, and two, they're interested, and three, they're activated, okay, and that they're really engaged. Hence, what this really, and number 4, I jumped one, strong attitudes and strong priors on the part of these discussion partners are less likely to change over time. They're more likely to persist. So we have a sort of a profile, if you will, of an expert discussant. That expert discussant is more likely to be expert, more likely to be an activist, that is more interested, more engaged, more, wants to talk about politics. And finally, they have attitudes that are probably more likely to persist over time. So that if I'm less interested, less engaged, and I interact with someone who's more interested, more engaged, that interaction is probably going to carry more weight with me and my preferences than it is with my informant. Hence, this points toward the role of well-informed, politically engaged citizens with strongly held viewpoints. Okay, so we did some experiments, some group-based experiments using Z-Tree software to see how this might work. So this is just one of the we've done a lot of these, but this is one of the studies we did. And we had 7 people in a room, and they had some, this is an economic experiment in the sense that we give you money to show up, and then we give you money to play each round, and each round is an election, and you can take that money and buy information. And then after you purchase some information, and this is sort of a stylized election, we'd say, hey, we've got a candidate, I can't tell you where he is, somewhere between 1 and 7. You have a position somewhere between 1 and 7. Each of the 7 people have an ideal point that's between 1 and 7. They know the candidate's out there somewhere, but they don't know where. And if they want to vote for the right candidate and get him elected, thereby winning more money, they have to find out where the candidate is. So we give them a chance to buy information. They have different costs, randomly assigned costs of information, so it's painful for some people to buy information. So some people get a lot of information for free. Other people can't afford much information. So there's variations in the level of information that people are able to purchase and are willing to purchase. And the size of the node up there is how much information a person purchased. Then, after they purchase the information, we say, okay, well, now I want you to, tell, before you interact with anyone else, I want you to make a guess, or we don't say guess, we say, where do you think the candidate lies? We won't tell anybody what you say. And so they give us what is, in effect, a Bayesian prior about what they think the candidate's position is based on this privately obtained, non-biased, and we tell them it's non-biased information. We say it's noisy, but it's not biased, okay? And we do that in language that they can totally grasp. And then we say, okay, now that you've done this, you can go out and get information from someone else, and you can make a request of anyone you want. Well, the direction of the edges up there, the direction of the arrows tell you where people go for information, and you'll see there are a lot of arrowheads pointing at the big circles. So they get it. They tend to cluster toward and move toward the people that have information Now notice, however, they also know what the positions of each of the individuals are. So think Anthony Downs, and when does it make rationally good sense to get information from someone else? It makes rationally good sense to get information from someone else if you can find someone who, number one, shares your preferences, and two, knows something. Well, we put people in situations where they have to make choices, and lots of times they can't find someone who shares their preferences and knows something. They have to choose between someone who knows something and someone who shares their preferences. And when we do that, it's randomly distributed, but when that happens to individuals, they regularly go for the expert and not for the agreeable person, which is a surprise to a lot of people, but we replicate it over and over and over again. And so as a consequence, what you see is there's a lot of people, you know, one's going to sevens, okay, two's going to fives. If you find somebody nearby, if you have a 1 and somebody is at 2 and they have a lot of information, you'll definitely go to them. You'd rather get someone you agree with, but knowledge or expertise trumps, in this experiment, repeatedly over and over again, expertise trumps like-minded preferences. Now, we ask them to update their prior at that point, and then we say you can do it again, you can go get more information. And then we say, okay, you can update your prior again. And so they have 3 opportunities to get information, and then finally they give us their last update, so we get a prior and then 3 updates. And what you see on the right-hand side is the decay in their prior over those 4 opportunities. And the top line up there is the decay in the prior for people who purchased 4 pieces of information, which is the most anyone can purchase. And the bottom line is for those who didn't purchase any information. Now, you don't have to purchase information. You don't have to have any additional information to know. We tell people that one candidate's position is between 1 and 6, and the other one is between 2 and 7. So you have a little bit of public information that everybody has that you can use to guide your behavior if you want. But the point is, people who purchase information have strong priors, and it decays very slowly. It persists very slowly relative to the people with less information. It decays slowly enough that, in fact, you can argue their preferences, their initially formed preferences and their priors are persistent in time. Okay, this isn't, however, just about individuals and experts and activists. Because we're trying to get at here again is who are these experts in the corridors of everyday life? Who are the influentials? And it's partially a question not simply about individuals. It's also a question about the structure of networks. Our colleague Ron Rappaport did this really cool study, and these are his data, and he's kind enough to loan them to us. And Ron, there was a dust-up in Williamsburg, Virginia. Ron teaches at William and Mary. And the city went after the students, okay? It's a nice upper-middle-class suburb, kind of. And they were getting tired of noisy parties and apartments with too many residents, and so they passed some ordinances that, a noise ordinance and limited the number of people in an apartment ordinance. And the students got upset about it, and they put their own candidate up for city council, and the candidate won the office. And Ron saw an opportunity and took it and went out and interviewed these people and asked each one of them who their 4 best friends were. And since he interviewed everybody in the student body except for missing non-responses, we have interview data not only on the person that answered the question initially, but also the people that person identified subject to missing data in the interview. And this is what that network looks like of the William and Mary students who answered the interview. Now, I'm just extracting out 2 networks for you, all right, 2 egocentric networks. And one of the egocentric networks is on the left-hand side, and we call this a very low-density network. And we call it a low-density network because there are a lot of nodes out there. Now, there are three levels. I guess it's 5 discussants, not 4. And so you see in the middle is the main respondent. The main respondent named 4 discussants. I'm sorry, 5 discussants, and each of those 5 discussants named another 5 discussants. But it turns out hardly anybody in that network knows anybody else, okay? I mean, it's really, there's not interconnectedness in the network at all. It's like my friends aren't the friends of my friends in that network. On the right-hand side, it's exactly the opposite. In this instance, once again, it's the first 2 zones beyond the main respondent. So the main respondent identifies 5 people. Those 5 people identify another 5 people. but these people, we don't actually depend on the interviews for the third zone, but you see that in this instance, there's a huge amount of interaction among the friends. So the friends of my friends are my friends. So what difference does it make when you have a network that's low density, like the left-hand side, versus high density on the right-hand side? Well, it all depends what you're after. So the analysis of the data shows, and this is still ongoing with a set of colleagues, including one who's in the audience right here, what it shows is that people are much more likely to be aware of the problem and the issues if they have a low-density network, okay? And why is that? It's because they're getting more information from more people, and the information isn't nearly as redundant. Now, we're not quite as far along with this data set on the other side of the equation, which is the cohesive networks, where everybody knows everybody else. But other data suggests that those networks are going to be more persuasive. They're not going to necessarily send rumors far out into the public and you know, have a contagion or a dissemination effect in which you're just going to get information spread far and wide. Rather, they're networks where every opinion you get in that network is going to reinforce every other opinion you got in that network. And going back to what we talked about earlier, that means you're going to have less disagreement, you're going to have less heterogeneity, you're going to end up with a more cohesive, more uniform network as a consequence of all those feedback loops that are right inside the network. Okay, so in conclusion, who's influential, under what circumstances, and with what implication? Well, first of all, this maybe changes the way we think about opinion leaders and public opinion. At least it's changed the way I think about it, all right? Influence is not restricted to the corridors of power. There's a lot of influence going on inside these networks. It also occurs in the corridors of everyday life. However, the participants are not involved and motivated by civic betterment. I can't point to this process and say this is all about people becoming better citizens and becoming more knowledgeable. These people aren't engaged in textbook kind of, or even read the newspaper kind of information collection typically. They're collecting opinions of people. They know something about the opinions, and they know something about the people, and they can connect opinions to people and circumstance and the rest. It gives them a lot of knowledge, but the participants are the participants are less likely to think their task is to try to educate each other, and they're more likely to think their task is to sort of express their preference as persuasively as they possibly can. So rather than seeing this as a process in civic betterment and improvement, we should perhaps see this process as just an extension of the political process. This is about citizens in the corridors of everyday life trying to influence people to convince them that their own opinion is probably a worthwhile opinion. And that makes it much more political and much less civic. Well, who are these influential citizens? There are people who know more. We've seen that. The amateur experts. There are people who care more. The amateur activists. They're the people who talk more. In another paper we've done, it's the moths who can't resist the flame of disagreement. You know, they're attracted to it. If somebody says something they disagree with, does this ring a bell for any of the political scientists in the room? I mean, a lot of political scientists sort of are moth-like. Okay, you know, they can't leave it alone. They, you know, when we named the paper for the moth and the flame, we were thinking about the scab that you can't resist picking. You know, it's like that open thing that you have to keep going after. There are also people who are located in heterogeneous communication networks with the opportunity to influence others, right? So if you're in a homogeneous network and everybody agrees, you're zero. You don't have any opportunity to influence anybody, right? Because you're surrounded by co-travelers and you're not, there's not going to be any persuasion involved. On the other hand, they are also people whose message are at least to some extent reinforced by others. If I'm the lone outsider in a network, I'm probably not going to have much influence either. The implications, I think, are important. They're not only important for analysts, they're probably important for the people who do populate the corridors of power and who do think about public opinion and who do try to understand the way public opinion moves and changes. And you can even see some of these viewpoints starting to percolate up through the way campaigns are organized. I'm thinking about Facebook and registering your preference and getting other people to go to your Facebook page and some of the social media campaigns that have become part of modern campaigning today. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
How important do you think that these sort of networks are for the spread of partisanship? So, in particular, there's this kind of discussion that a lot of civic participation work focuses on how people vote, right? But you're talking a lot about the spread of information amongst people. So I'm curious to what extent you think that there's kind of an untapped area for studying civic participation, focusing entirely on these kinds of network effects.
So in terms of vote outcomes?
Not just for vote outcomes, but the fate of parties in the electorate. So a greater focus on people selling politics to each other rather than just focusing on what happens at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's an uphill, maybe I can go back to this actually. I think what's instructive for me on this question goes back to those cross-national results and looking at some of the parties that have an easier time and a better time. So if you look down at the FDP in West and East Germany, you know, FDP is kind of on the ropes these days, not doing so well, and now, you know, we don't sort them separately by East and West Germany any longer. We sort of treat them separate, you know. This was just the convenience for the 90 study, or the 90 election, which was the first pan-German, which was two separate elections, really. But, so the FDP, but even here, you know, you see the FDP in terms of being below, you know, just barely above the break-even line, the 45-degree angle line. Why is that? Well, you know, the FDP was sort of an extension of the Christian Democrats. And at the time, well, actually it switched, right? It was actually it was with the Social Democrats for a while, but by this time it was an extension of the Christian Democrats. And what it meant is that they were regularly interacting with other people who were not in fact Free Democrats, but who were in fact Christian Democrats. And I think what happened, I think over the long haul, it's tough to maintain a party that way because you're basically, I mean, why bother, right? And in fact, maybe the only reason the Free Democrats lasted as long as they did was because Christian Democrats thought some of them ought to vote for the Free Democrats to get them past the threshold so they could have representation in the legislature. So I think what it says to me is that, you know, it's going to be hard for parties to maintain themselves if they can't at least have majority support as on the average inside their networks. And, you know, I think the Free Democrats had problems with it. Now, at the other extreme, you got Comito up there in the upper left-hand corner. Now, boy, I've done it before, and I don't remember exactly what it is, but you can estimate the rejection parameter for Comito, the members of Comito, and what the odds are that they're going to reject, you know, political discussion with people that aren't supporters of Comito. And it's really, really high to get them that high. I mean, they're almost as high as the major parties, and they're only getting, you know, roughly 10% of the vote. How does that work? Well, the reason it works is Comito is based on a Buddhist lay organization, and so they've got an organizational basis to the party quite apart from sort of, you know, where you live and where you work and all that sort of stuff, right? So what it really means is that there's an organizational base that it's in fact sustaining the party and creating networks of support that make the level of support within those discussion networks much higher than you'd expect. So for me, it's you know, it's sort of the salmon swimming upstream at the end of the swim. It's really tough, I think, to maintain momentum and going in that direction. Moreover, when we look at the instances of a disagreement, sustained disagreement is very seldom there is sustained disagreement, but it's very seldom the case that individuals are that are a part of a minority in their own social context. So most of the people that, and remember, these are in a certain sense an equilibrium outcome. You know, it's the end of the election. We're asking people who they talked with recently. So I think in those instances, you've got this equilibrium condition. You've got people that have a little bit more support inside their network on average than in the population, and probably more than a majority, and it's enough to maintain the party. But I think once you start slipping down below that level, it's going to be tough to maintain, you know, partisanship or voting behavior.
Hi, Bob. Thanks. I always love hearing you talk, and I'm glad that your enthusiasm for these topics seems so infectious because I think it keeps us all engaged in asking good questions and working on this stuff. So I was hoping to ask you to step back to what the frame you gave at the beginning of the talk about how the warnings about ecological fallacy in some ways, combined with a lot of other things, sparked our insistence on individual study in a way that perhaps made us dangerously unaware of the individual fallacy, the reverse. And I'm wondering if I can put you on the spot a little bit and ask you to sort of pontificate off the top of your head if there are particular sort of key findings in the discipline across any subfield or whatever that you think are perhaps particularly in peril because we've been so focused on individual level at the expense of the aggregate and the network structures and so forth. And another way of asking that might be, where do you think are the questions, are the problems to be solved in which this frame of thinking might be the most productive?
Well, first of all, I need to issue a denial, and you know, there are a lot of people with my stripes, okay, and that think about these things who have sort of gone after the University of Michigan studies, and I don't share that. I mean, there are some wonderful studies at the University of Michigan that totally locate voters inside by prominent folks that were part of the team that locate voters, you know, in a context, in a setting, in a network. You know, so I mean, the first one I would think of right off the bat is Warren Miller's One-Party Politics and the Voter, which is just an absolutely terrific article on what it means to be part of a partisan minority, you know, and he revolutionized the way we think about these things, because the way that people typically thought about that before 1956 when he wrote that paper was that, you know, minorities survive because they're so cohesive and resolute and tough, you know, and that's the way they do it, and they turn inward and they hang on. And he went out and studied, you know, minorities inside American counties in the early election studies and found out that the minorities were in fact, you know, sort of falling apart. They were having trouble. They couldn't connect means and ends. They weren't following through. They were in disarray. So the minority voters in a particular setting tend to be in disarray. And you know, he went to he got it right away. I mean, it's just a wonderful piece of work. It's, you know, 1956 technology, but it's a terrific piece, and it's still worth going back and reading periodically. You know, Of Time and Partisan Stability, I mean, it's a fantastic Converse article. All the stuff that I just had a chance to talk to Dick Nemi out there, you know, all the Jennings and Nemi work and all the work that Jennings has kept on doing and so it's terrific. So I'm not hammering, I'm not anti-survey, I'm not anti, you know, that isn't what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the same problems you run into when you know, if we're concerned about ecological fallacies, and we definitely should be concerned about ecological fallacies, but the solution is not to go individualistic. The solution is to figure out what the source of non-constancy is for individuals. And the source of non-constancy for individuals is, you know, it's determined by networks, contexts, settings, political systems, you know, just, you know, in Japan, you have to look at, you know, what the organizational base of the party is. I mean, it's a complicated, wonderful, delicious world, you know, and we have this great opportunity to go after it and sort of figure it out. But, you know, I mean, I had a colleague at Indiana, John Williams, and John always used to tease me about doing surveys, and he'd say, he had this great Texas drawl, and he'd say, now, Bob, how many people became political scientists to do surveys, Bob? I mean, really, you know? And he's right, you know, I mean, we're not here to collect data on individuals. We're not here to do surveys. We're here to sort of make meaningful statements about politics. And politics is about interdependent individuals. Economists know it, social psychologists know it, political scientists know it, sociologists know it. And we have to be careful that we don't get lured into sort of easy answers that sort of, you know, disengage that interdependence, and we need to stay focused on it.
Hi, I was thinking in this presentation, a lot of what we understand about social networks comes from kind of snapshots of a social network, and then we sort of infer that influence must have happened somewhere along the way. What can you say about kind of the process of social influence and why or how that happens, or how we might kind of study from inside the black box out?
Yeah, terrific question. You know, I would like to say that I quit doing surveys and started doing experiments because, you know, for some noble reason, but mostly it was because I was having trouble getting funding to do more surveys, okay? So a bit of candor is required, all right? On the other hand, so in a certain sense, I got sort of drug out feet first from doing surveys, and I started doing experiments. But for me, it's been a great move, and it's a great move because it, you know, external, you know, the experiments I described to you, there's nothing great about those in terms of external validity, you know. On the other hand, we anchor those in what we already know to be externally valid and based on the pictures that we've drawn with these surveys. And in that context, it allows us to do this really, it's really, for me, it's been really rewarding and sort of exciting to be able to get at the process, so my little funny story about this is when we got the results and had the decay rates, I sent the paper to Milton Lodge, and because he was just doing all of his motivated reasoning stuff, I'm sort of wondering, I'm thinking, is Milton going to like this? What's he going to say? And he sent it back to me, and he said, I knew that was right, which I thought, now that proves motivated reasoning, And so, but he's right. I mean, it gets closer to the process, and because I've referred to it as a strong, people with strong priors are less likely to change their beliefs. That's all about how the process works, and so the people without strong priors, it isn't that they cave in immediately to information they don't agree with. It's just that the bam, 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 the continual stream of information that they don't agree with is more likely to move them than it is the person that walks into that situation with a really strong prior that, they have a lot of confidence in, they're not going to change. So, for me, that's the sort of path back, is to spend more time thinking about process in the context of doing experimental research to get at it. And a lot of people are already doing that. I think, though, this, and this is not again, I'm not trying to evangelize, but I think the folks that do experiments have to have to give some thought to interdependence as well, because it's not, I've got a lot of friends who are social psychologists, and they admit that, the social kind of gets driven out of psychology sometimes because they do individual subject experiments, and we've sort of gotten out of the habit of trying to watch interaction in systematic ways. And so I think the way to watch interaction in systematic ways is to watch people interact and come up with some ways for doing that.
So I think we have time for one last question. It goes to Bill.
I was trying to think of an example where focusing on the individual gets it wrong. And here, tell me whether I'm thinking the right way about this. Techniques to work backwards from votes to ideal points in Congress. We know the partisan networks have diverged over time. So Democrats are talking much more to Democrats, Republicans are talking much more to Republicans. Am I thinking that what you would say then is, yeah, you're getting the self-reinforcing effect in votes, which is pulling them apart, or at least appears to pull them apart, even if there's not anything really going on there?
Yeah, I think that's plausible. I mean, we forget that these strategic, high-powered politicians are people too, and that they, if they're not talking to each other, they're not talking to each other, and they're going to diverge more and more and more. And so it's not just simply the guy that wins the election and the fault of the guy that wins the election. It's the fault of the system that these guys step into when they, get off the boat in Washington, basically. And there's a lot of ways of thinking about that problem with voters and with politicians, I think.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Bob.
Thank you.